The truth that shattered my world. Samuel had always believed that life was meant to be simple and straightforward. A good job, a loving wife, a comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood, everything seemed to fall perfectly into place. He worked as a project manager at a thriving tech company, a position that allowed him to keep a balanced lifestyle. His co-workers respected him, and the work was fulfilling enough to challenge him without overwhelming him. He had always taken pride in the fact that his life, in its quiet monotony, felt secure. His marriage to Karen was no exception. They had met in college, young and idealistic, both driven by the same ambition to build something meaningful together. They were inseparable. They bought a small home on the edge of the city and, over the years, filled it with laughter, shared meals, and dreams. They never fought, never raised their voices. It wasn't perfect, but they both believed it was enough. Samuel thought Karen was his best friend, the person he could always rely on. Lately, however, there had been a change in Karen. It was subtle at first, something small enough to be overlooked, a slightly longer pause before she answered his questions, a more distracted look when he spoke. Samuel told himself that it was probably nothing. Karen had recently been promoted at her marketing job, and he knew the pressures were mounting. Long hours, tight deadlines, he figured it was just the stress of her career catching up with her. The first real sign that something might be wrong came on a Tuesday night. Samuel had come home to find Karen sitting in the living room, her face buried in her phone. Normally, she would have greeted him with a warm smile, asked how his day went, maybe shared a funny story from work. But that day, she barely looked up. When she did, her smile was forced. She told him she had a late meeting to prepare for and excused herself to her office, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The small things began adding up. Karen's phone became her constant companion. She would take it with her to the bathroom, often locking the screen as soon as she heard him coming down the hallway. She seemed to spend more time at work, taking calls well into the evening. The loving, open woman he had married was slowly turning into someone he didn't fully recognize. Still, Samuel told himself it was just the pressures of life. Work stress, the pressures of Karen's recent promotion, perhaps even just a rough patch. He tried to dismiss the nagging feeling in the back of his mind, telling himself he was being paranoid. Maybe he was overthinking things. But the unease only deepened, especially when Karen began coming home late, often without explanation. Some nights, she'd arrive long after Samuel had finished dinner, eating alone. They would talk, but the conversations felt strained. She would give vague responses to questions about her day, and she was unusually evasive when asked about upcoming work trips. It wasn't the kind of thing that screamed affair, but the cracks were beginning to show. Samuel started wondering if he was imagining things or if his marriage, as perfect as it seemed, was falling apart in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. One evening, he sat in their kitchen, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. He thought back to when things were simpler. When they first met, when their love had felt like a safe haven. But now, with each passing day, that sense of security was slipping through his fingers, and Samuel couldn't shake the growing fear that something far more troubling was lurking just beneath the surface. At first, Samuel tried to ignore it. The strange distance between him and Karen, the unexplained absences, the silent tension that lingered in their home. He told himself it was just a phase, a rough patch that every marriage went through. After all, they had been together for over a decade. Surely, this was just a temporary blip. But as the days turned into weeks, something started to shift inside him. His growing unease became harder to dismiss. One evening, he returned home from work early, hoping to surprise Karen. He wanted to take her out to dinner, maybe just to reconnect and remind themselves of the closeness they had once shared. But as he stepped through the front door, he found Karen sitting on the couch, absorbed in her phone. It was the same routine, almost as if nothing had changed, except now there was something heavier in the air. "Hey, how was your day?" Samuel asked, trying to sound casual, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. Karen looked up for a moment, giving him a quick smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Busy," she said, her voice distant. "You know, work stuff." Samuel couldn't remember the last time they'd had a genuine conversation about anything outside of logistics, work, bills, chores. She used to tell him everything, how her day had gone, what had made her laugh, what had made her frustrated. Now, it felt like there was an invisible wall between them. When she spoke, it was always about surface-level things, never anything personal. That night, they ate in silence. Samuel watched her pick at her food, barely touching it, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. He tried to spark a conversation about their plans for the weekend, but Karen's responses were short, distracted. She mentioned a work event she was attending and that she'd be out late again. Her eyes flickered to her phone on the table, and she reached for it, locking it quickly when she noticed Samuel's gaze. "Everything okay?" Samuel asked, keeping his tone light, but there was an edge of concern creeping into his voice. Karen nodded, her face momentarily betraying a flicker of guilt before she masked it with a smile. "Yeah, just work. I'm tired, Sam. Can we talk later?" But later never came. That night, after Karen had gone to bed, Samuel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling a gnawing sense of something being wrong. It wasn't just the physical distance, there was an emotional coldness now. She had become a stranger in their own home. The next few days, the pattern continued. Karen came home late from work again, and this time, when Samuel asked about her day, her response was vague, almost dismissive. "Busy. Same as always." It was small, these little things, but it was enough to fuel Samuel's growing suspicions. Her late nights became more frequent, her phone more guarded. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening just out of sight, something that he wasn't being told. One Friday, after Karen had left for yet another late meeting, Samuel found himself pacing around their living room, trying to shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. He'd been dismissing it for weeks, but the doubt was too much now. He needed to know. The temptation was unbearable. When Karen had left, she'd forgotten to lock her phone. He stood in front of the screen, hands trembling slightly as he stared at the phone in his hand. It wasn't something he would have ever done, invade her privacy like this, but the doubt had become too strong. He unlocked the phone and found nothing at first, no strange messages, no suspicious apps. But then, as he scrolled, a text message popped up. It was from Mike, her colleague. "I miss you. Can't wait to see you again soon." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, each letter a punch to his stomach. His heart raced, and his mind struggled to process what he was reading. Mike? The same Mike who had always been so friendly when he'd met him at company events. How long had this been going on? Was it serious? Samuel stared at the message, frozen, his mind spinning with 1,000 questions, none of which had answers. This was the proof he had feared, the truth he had desperately tried not to believe. But there it was, in black and white. His wife, the woman he had trusted with everything, was seeing someone else. His hands shook as he set the phone back on the table, his stomach turning in knots. Everything he had known, everything he had believed in, now felt like it was crumbling before him. In the silence of the house, he sat motionless, trying to catch his breath. He wasn't sure what to do next. He didn't know if he should confront her immediately or let it simmer until he had a clearer sense of what to do. All he knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The truth sat heavily in Samuel's chest, suffocating him as he replayed the text from Mike over and over in his mind. "I miss you. Can't wait to see you again soon." The words were seared into his memory, the implication of their meaning unbearable. The reality was too raw to process. His wife, Karen, the woman he had shared everything with, had been lying to him for months. A million questions rushed through Samuel's mind, but the one that stood out the most was, how could she do this to him? He had always prided himself on their relationship, on the trust they shared. He had never questioned her loyalty. But now, that foundation was shattered. Was their entire marriage a lie? The house felt cold, emptier than it ever had before. The silence around him was deafening. As he sat on the couch, staring at Karen's phone, the weight of it all became too much. He didn't want to confront her yet, he wasn't ready. What if he was wrong? What if there was an explanation he hadn't considered? But deep down, he knew. He had the proof, the undeniable truth that his wife was involved with someone else. His thoughts raced as he waited for Karen to come home. The hours felt like days. He couldn't sit still. He paced, ran his hands through his hair, his heart beating painfully in his chest. What was he supposed to do now? Should he confront her directly? Or wait until he had all the facts, all the evidence? Eventually, the sound of the front door opening interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Karen's footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Samuel felt his body tense. She stepped into the living room, her tired eyes meeting his for just a moment before she looked away. "Hi," Karen said quietly, setting her purse down on the table. She didn't seem surprised to see him sitting there, but the heaviness in the air was undeniable. Samuel knew she could sense something was wrong. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, staring at her. His mind screamed for answers, but his mouth went dry. "Samuel?" Karen asked, her voice tinged with concern. "What's going on? You're scaring me." Her words were innocent, but to Samuel, they were a bitter reminder of the woman she used to be. The woman who had once been so open, so real. Now, it felt like he was looking at a stranger. "Karen," Samuel said, his voice trembling slightly, "I need you to tell me the truth." He stood up, his legs feeling shaky. "Who is Mike?" Her eyes widened, a fleeting moment of panic flashing across her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her silence was the answer he feared most. "I saw the message, Karen," Samuel continued, his voice growing firmer. "I saw the texts. I know what's been going on." Karen's face paled, her eyes flickering with guilt and shame. She took a step back, her hands shaking as she clasped them together. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was suffocating. Samuel wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, Karen broke the silence. I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It just happened. I never wanted to hurt you, Sam. I never wanted any of this." The pain in her voice only made it worse. How could she say those words? How could she betray him like this and then try to excuse it with such weak, hollow explanations? "Who is he to you?" Samuel demanded, his voice cracking with the weight of his hurt. "Was this just a fling? Or has it been more than that?" Karen's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at her hands. "It wasn't just a fling. It's been going on for months." The confession hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. Months. He tried to breathe through the pain, but it was almost impossible. The woman he had built his life with had been sharing herself, emotionally, physically, with another man for half of their marriage. "I don't know what happened, Sam," Karen continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I felt lost for so long, and when Mike and I started talking, it just felt like someone finally saw me. He made me feel alive again." She paused, her eyes pleading for understanding. "But I never meant to hurt you. I swear, I didn't." Samuel could feel his anger bubbling up, a wave of rage surging through him. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" he asked incredulously, his voice rising. "You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around, and you didn't mean to hurt me?" Karen flinched, as though his words physically struck her. "I'm sorry, Sam. I really am. I was confused. I don't know what came over me." Samuel wanted to scream, to make her understand the depth of his pain, but instead, he found himself standing in the middle of the room, speechless. The life he had thought he was living, the life he thought he knew, was now shattered. All at once, it felt like everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built with Karen, meant nothing. He didn't know what to do. The betrayal felt too great to overcome, and yet he couldn't bring himself to just walk away. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized that nothing, not even the love they once shared, could undo what had happened. This was the moment that would define the rest of his life. The air between Samuel and Karen hung heavy, thick with regret, shame, and a sense of loss that neither of them knew how to process. Karen's tear-streaked face was a sharp contrast to the cold fury in Samuel's eyes. Her hands trembled as she wiped her cheeks, but the damage had already been done. Every word she spoke felt like an attempt to undo the irreparable. I never wanted to hurt you, Karen repeated, her voice cracking. I was confused, Sam. I don't know what happened, but I never stopped loving you. It's just. I didn't know how to fix things between us, and I felt like I was losing myself. Samuel stood there, his body rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. Every inch of him screamed to lash out, to yell, to let the hurt and the anger spill out uncontrollably. But the words wouldn't come. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart, thrumming in his chest like a drumbeat, drowning out everything else. You didn't know how to fix things, he finally managed to say, his voice low and strained. You didn't think talking to me would have been a good place to start. You didn't think honesty could have saved us. Karen's eyes filled with fresh tears as she took a step toward him, but Samuel instinctively took a step back, his breath shallow and fast. The distance between them had grown too wide, emotionally, mentally, and now, physically. I'm sorry, Sam. I truly am, she whispered. I never meant for it to get this far. Mike, he was just someone who understood me in a way I felt like you didn't anymore. But that doesn't mean I don't care about you. That doesn't mean I don't love you. Samuel wanted to scream. How could she possibly say that? How could she still say she loved him after everything? After the betrayal, after the lies. He wanted to understand, to feel some trace of the woman he once adored, but it felt like she had disappeared into a version of herself he couldn't reach. You love me? Samuel asked, his voice rising, bitter with disbelief. You love me, and you've been doing this behind my back. For months. His voice broke, and the weight of it all hit him like a wave, dragging him under. Sam, please. Karen reached out for him again, but he stepped back quickly, his chest tight with anger and hurt. I trusted you, Samuel said, his voice sharp and edged with pain. You were everything to me, Karen. And you destroyed that. You destroyed us. Karen's face contorted with anguish, and she reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled away. He couldn't let her touch him, not like this. Not when the world he thought he knew was unraveling before him. He turned away from her, his emotions a storm of confusion and anger. He didn't know what to do next. Could he ever look at her the same way again? Could he even begin to forgive her, or had she already taken something too precious to be repaired? Where do we go from here, Karen? He finally asked, his voice hollow. What am I supposed to do now? Karen stood there, frozen, as if the question had rendered her speechless. She opened her mouth but didn't speak. No words could fix what had been broken. And deep down, Samuel knew that, no matter how much she apologized, this was something that couldn't be erased. The hurt was too deep. Do you want me to leave? Karen asked softly, her voice barely a whisper, as if she was afraid of the answer. Samuel felt a pang in his chest at the thought. His first instinct was to say yes, to tell her to pack her bags and leave. But something inside him stopped him from saying the words. Was that really what he wanted? Did he really want to end their life together like this? I don't know, he muttered, looking away from her, as if the very act of facing her would break him completely. I don't know if I can stay in this lie. I don't know if I can trust you again. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the silence of two people standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Samuel finally left the room, not knowing where to go or what to do next. He needed space. He needed time to think. To figure out what had happened to the woman he had married, the woman he had thought he knew. But most of all, he needed to figure out what to do with his own broken heart. The days that followed. The following days were a blur of silence. Karen had packed a bag, taking only what she needed, and left the house to stay with her sister. Samuel was left behind, drowning in a mixture of anger, disbelief, and the overwhelming sense of emptiness. He thought he would feel relief. After all, he was now living in the aftermath of a truth that had shaken his entire existence. But instead, there was a quiet sadness that hung over him. The house, once full of life and warmth, now felt like a shell. Every room reminded him of her, of the way things used to be. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he could forgive Karen, or if he even wanted to. The betrayal felt like too much, but there was a small part of him that still clung to the hope that they could rebuild, that they could find a way to heal. But that part was buried deep, drowned in the weight of the lies and the broken trust. The days without Karen were harder than Samuel had imagined. His mind kept racing through the memories of their life together, searching for clues, trying to understand when things had gone wrong. Every moment they had shared, the late nights talking, their spontaneous trips, the laughter, felt tainted now. It was like he was seeing everything in a new light, and it made him feel like he had been living a lie. It wasn't just the betrayal that gnawed at him. It was the realization that he hadn't seen it coming. How had he missed the signs? How had he been so blind to the distance between them, to the small changes in Karen's behavior that now seemed so obvious? He couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy, as though he had somehow failed her, failed their marriage. But as the days turned into a week, a new wave of emotions started to surface. Amid the anger and hurt, there was something else, an ache, a longing for the woman he had once loved with everything he had. The woman who had been his best friend, his confidant. Samuel knew that if he was going to move forward, he had to confront the emotions that were holding him back, the need for closure, the desire to understand why Karen had done what she did, and, above all, the question that lingered like a dark cloud, could he ever forgive her? He wasn't sure. One evening, as he sat in the dimly lit living room, Samuel's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He hesitated for a moment before reaching for it. The screen lit up with Karen's name. He had avoided talking to her for the past week, unsure of what to say. But tonight, something inside him broke, and he picked up the phone. "Hey," Karen's voice came through the speaker, soft, hesitant. "Can we talk?" Samuel stared at the phone, his pulse quickening. He didn't know what to expect from this conversation. Part of him wanted to scream at her, to demand answers that would never satisfy him. But another part of him, one that was too afraid to admit, wanted to hear her out. He had to know. He had to understand. "All right," he said, his voice hoarse, betraying the rawness of his emotions. "We can talk." There was a long pause, and Samuel could almost hear Karen gathering the courage to speak. "Sam, I know I've hurt you in ways I can never undo. I wish I could take everything back, but I can't. I know that." Samuel closed his eyes, taking a shaky breath. "Why, Karen? Why him? Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me you were struggling?" "I don't know," Karen admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know. Mike was easy. He was someone who didn't have the history with me, who didn't have the weight of our past. He was new, and it felt exciting. But that's no excuse. It was wrong, Sam. I'm so sorry." Samuel clenched his jaw, his heart aching. The explanation sounded so simple, so empty. But he also knew that the truth was rarely black and white. He understood the temptation of something new, something that made you feel alive again, but he could never justify the hurt it caused. "I can't just forget this, Karen," he said softly, the words tasting bitter. "You betrayed me. You broke something inside me. And I don't know if I can ever trust you again." "I know," Karen replied. "And I wouldn't ask you to. I needed you to hear me. I needed you to know how sorry I am. I was selfish. I thought I was fixing something inside me, but instead, I destroyed the one thing I should have protected the most. I'll carry that with me forever." Samuel sat back in the chair, staring blankly at the wall. The silence between them grew, heavy and thick. He didn't know what to say. He had so many questions, but none of them seemed to matter anymore. The trust was gone, and maybe it was never meant to come back. "Do you still love me, Karen?" Samuel asked, his voice quiet. The question hung between them like a lifeline. "Yes," Karen said immediately. "I love you, Sam. But I know love isn't enough to fix this. I know that. I just need you to know how much I regret everything, how much I wish I could go back and make it right." Samuel closed his eyes, his heart torn between the anger that had consumed him and the love that still lingered. He didn't know what to do with the love he still felt for her. He didn't know if it was enough to start rebuilding. "I don't know what I want right now," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I need time. Time to figure out if I can even look at you the same way again." "I understand," Karen whispered. "I'll give you all the time you need. I just wanted to talk to you. I couldn't live with myself not saying how sorry I am." As the conversation ended, Samuel was left with the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. He wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet. But the small flicker of hope that had once existed between them wasn't entirely gone. It felt fragile, like something that could easily break if pushed too hard. And so, for the time being, he focused on the only thing he could control, himself. He needed to heal. He needed to find the strength to move forward, whether that meant rebuilding their relationship or letting go completely. The road ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: this was just the beginning of a long journey, one of pain, self-discovery, and, perhaps, eventual healing. The days following his conversation with Karen felt like walking through a fog. Samuel went through the motions of daily life, going to work, eating, sleeping, but everything felt numb, like he was watching his life unfold from a distance. There were moments of clarity, moments where he felt like he might be able to move forward, but they were fleeting. The weight of the betrayal was still too fresh, too raw. In the quiet of his apartment, Samuel found himself reflecting more than ever before. The anger that had once been all-consuming began to subside, but in its place, a deep sadness took root. He thought about Karen constantly, about their history, about their love. How had things gotten so bad? How had they ended up here? He began to realize that this wasn't just about Karen's affair. It was about the disconnect that had slowly crept into their marriage, unnoticed at first. The growing distance between them, the lack of communication, the unspoken needs and desires that neither of them had addressed. But none of this made the pain of her betrayal any easier to bear. No amount of introspection could erase the fact that Karen had chosen someone else. She had been with Mike, sharing parts of herself that should have only belonged to him. The thought of it made his stomach churn. One evening, as Samuel sat in the dim light of his living room, he found himself staring at the old photos scattered across the table. Wedding pictures. Pictures from vacations. Smiling faces, filled with hope and love. He picked up a photo of the two of them on their honeymoon, laughing together in front of a waterfall. He remembered how carefree and happy they had been. There was no sign then of the cracks that would appear later. No indication that their marriage would eventually break under the weight of secrets and lies. As the hours passed, Samuel realized he had been holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. The person he had once known, the woman he had married, was no longer the same. She had changed, and perhaps so had he. He wasn't the same man who had stood at the altar, promising to love and cherish her forever. Time, mistakes, and hurt had all left their marks. That night, for the first time in a long while, Samuel found himself thinking about his own happiness. About what he needed. It wasn't just about forgiveness anymore, it was about healing, finding peace within himself, and deciding what kind of future he wanted to create, with or without Karen. A few days later, Karen called again. This time, Samuel wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he answered the phone anyway. "Hey," Karen's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "How are you doing?" Samuel leaned back in his chair, his thoughts still scattered, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel overwhelmed by the anger that had once consumed him. I'm doing better," he said honestly, his voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot." There was a pause on the other end. "About what?" "About everything," Samuel replied. "About us. About what I need. I've realized that I need to start focusing on myself. I've been so focused on our marriage, on fixing what's broken, that I lost sight of who I am outside of all of this." Karen was quiet for a moment, and Samuel could almost hear her processing his words. "Sam. I get it. I've been selfish, I know. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't expect anything from you. But I just want you to know, I'm working on myself too. I don't want to be the person who hurt you anymore. I'm trying to understand what happened, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right, if you'll let me." Samuel swallowed the lump in his throat, unsure of how to respond. A part of him still wanted to believe that they could fix things, that there was a way back to the love they had once shared. But another part of him knew that the road to healing was long and uncertain. "I'm not sure where we go from here, Karen," Samuel said quietly. "But I'm starting to realize that it's okay not to have all the answers right now. It's okay to take things one step at a time. I need to focus on myself for a while. I need to rebuild, to figure out who I am, and what I want moving forward." "I understand," Karen replied, her voice filled with sorrow. "And I'll give you that space. I'll be here when you're ready, Sam. I want to make things right. But I'm also ready to let go if that's what you need." Samuel closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He didn't have the answers, and he didn't know what the future held. But for the first time since everything had fallen apart, he felt a glimmer of hope. Hope for himself. Hope that he could heal. Hope that, whatever happened, he could find peace again. "Thank you, Karen," Samuel said softly. "I appreciate you giving me the time I need. And maybe one day we can figure this out. But for now, I just need to be on my own." "I'll respect that," Karen said, her voice quiet, but filled with understanding. "Take care of yourself, Sam." As they hung up the phone, Samuel felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The road ahead was still unclear, but he knew one thing for sure, he was no longer waiting for answers from Karen. He was taking control of his own healing. Whether that meant reconciling or moving on, he would figure it out. He was ready to rebuild, piece by piece, starting with himself. Weeks passed, and Samuel felt himself slowly starting to come back to life. The days that had once seemed endless began to feel more manageable, and the ache in his chest, though still present, became less suffocating. He spent time rediscovering old hobbies, going for long walks, and reconnecting with friends he had neglected over the years. For the first time in a long time, he found joy in the little things, laughing at a joke with a friend, enjoying a cup of coffee while watching the sunrise, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. These small moments, though fleeting, reminded him that life still had meaning, even without the woman he thought he would spend the rest of his life with. As the weeks turned into months, Samuel began to see himself more clearly. He realized that, for a long time, he had defined himself by his relationship with Karen, by their shared life, their shared dreams. When that crumbled, he had been left wondering who he was outside of the person he had been with her. But now, slowly, he was finding that he was more than the sum of his relationship with Karen. He was a whole person on his own, someone who had needs, desires, and aspirations that weren't dependent on anyone else's validation. But that didn't mean he was done with the pain. Healing wasn't linear. There were still days when the memories of their life together flooded his mind, when he could still hear her laugh in the back of his mind or see the way she looked at him when they first met. On those days, he allowed himself to feel the hurt, to mourn the loss. And on other days, he felt a sense of peace, like he was finally letting go of the burden of expectation and betrayal. And then one afternoon, Karen called him again. Samuel had been dreading this moment for weeks. The last time they spoke, she had respected his need for space, but he knew this call would be different. He knew it was time for one final conversation. "Hey, Sam," Karen said, her voice soft, almost tentative. "I just wanted to check in. I've been thinking about you a lot. I know we've been distant, but I miss you. And I wanted to know how you're doing." Samuel took a deep breath. His heart raced, but he felt more grounded now than he ever had. "I'm doing okay," he said, his voice steady, though there was an underlying sadness that he couldn't shake. "I've been focusing on myself. I've been working through everything, and I think I'm finally starting to find some peace." There was a long pause on the other end, and Samuel could almost hear Karen's heart breaking in the silence. "I'm glad you're finding peace," she said, her voice filled with quiet regret. "But I need you to know. I don't regret trying to fix things with you. I don't regret loving you. I've learned that I can't undo the past. And I can't ask you to forgive me for something that may be unforgivable." Samuel closed his eyes. The words stung, but they also felt like a necessary release. For the first time, he wasn't holding on to the past. He wasn't waiting for a moment when everything would magically return to the way it had been. He had accepted that some things couldn't be fixed. Some wounds were too deep to heal. "I've been thinking about that a lot," Samuel said softly. "I've spent so much time trying to figure out if I could forgive you, if we could go back to what we had. But the truth is, I don't think I can go back. I don't think we can go back." Karen's breath caught in her throat. "I understand, Sam. I understand more than you know." Samuel felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for so long began to lift. He wasn't letting go of the love he had for her, but he was letting go of the idea that they could ever be the same. It was a painful realization, but also one that gave him the freedom to move forward. "I'm not angry anymore," Samuel said, his voice calmer now. "I think I was angry for a long time, but I'm done with that. It's just time to move on. For both of us." "Thank you, Sam," Karen whispered. "Thank you for giving me that." The conversation ended quietly, and as Samuel hung up the phone, he felt the last of the tension in his body ease. He knew that letting go of Karen was the right thing to do. But it didn't mean he was abandoning her or erasing their memories. It simply meant that he was finally choosing himself, choosing the future he deserved. In the days that followed, Samuel began to embrace his independence with a sense of newfound purpose. He didn't know exactly where his life was headed, but he knew he was stronger for having gone through this journey. He had learned to find peace in the midst of pain and to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about accepting the past and allowing yourself to move forward. And as he stood on the balcony of his apartment one evening, looking out at the sunset, Samuel realized that sometimes, the hardest thing you can do is to forgive yourself for staying in a place where you weren't truly happy. But the second hardest thing? Letting go. And for the first time in months, Samuel felt a quiet sense of freedom. He was ready to move forward. With each passing day, he grew more confident in his ability to heal, to rebuild. And maybe, just maybe, he could find love again. Not with Karen, but with someone who would truly appreciate him, flaws and all. But for now, Samuel was content. He had found peace, and that was all that mattered. If you enjoy the story, please like and subscribe our YouTube channel. Your support mean world for us. Thank you.